So what I wanted to talk about today is a policy update on protected areas as it relates to old growth forests and nature protection in British Columbia. The BC government has just released its mandate letters on what the ministers should be focusing on. And the mandate letters are disappointing from our perspective. They barely mention saving ecosystems and old growth forests. The mentions are in there, so they do mention the need for the BC government to fulfill their old growth commitments and to protect 30% by 2030, but they're mentioned in passing, and there's very little other detail. What's still needed is a commitment to implement the biodiversity and ecosystem health framework, which is supposed to be the policy framework for a paradigm shift that the BC government committed to put ecological integrity at the forefront of any land and resource management decisions. Most importantly, ecosystem-based targets, protection targets for every ecosystem that have got to include forest productivity distinctions. That basically means distinguishing between areas that grow small trees versus big trees, high productivity old growth like this. It's like the GPS of protected areas creation. Without a GPS, in this province, you're going to end up in the wrong place. They're going to save essentially the small trees and log the big trees. Also needed is a commitment to solutions-based funding. That is, funding for First Nations if they are to undertake deferrals on old growth logging in areas where they have an economic interest. Many First Nations have an economic dependency on old growth logging. There is no government money allocated for First Nations to undertake deferrals for several years while they decide which areas they might want to protect or how much or if they want to protect these endangered old growth forests. There's also a need for the government to undertake a protected area strategy. This is absolutely vital. The BC government has basically been sitting on its haunches waiting for First Nations to approach them on areas that the First Nations are interested in saving, whereas the First Nations typically lack the capacity and also the economic alternatives to protect many of these endangered ecosystems. The BC government instead needs to come up with a list of candidate high priority areas with ecosystem-based targets driving which areas are priority. And then they need to proactively approach First Nations to see if they're interested in discussions with the requisite resourcing that may be needed to undertake a movement towards protecting some of these areas as Indigenous protected and conserved areas, typically legislated as conservancies in British Columbia. A proactive approach is vital. And the BC government needs to close the loopholes, essentially logging loopholes in the conservation reserve system, old growth management areas where under timber industry lobby, boundaries can be moved around, or wildlife habitat areas where often logging occurs in them. Now, in the mandate letters, there's a high emphasis on the economy. Some conservationists are going to complain about that, but we don't see it that way. I think it's needed to have an economic emphasis along with a conservation emphasis so that the path is paved for conservation with congruent economic policies like a value-added, sustainable second growth forest industry, a modernized smart forest industry, instead of one based on logging old growth and raw log exports. So it's sort of like you can try to push a boulder up the hill against gravity if the economy is based on old growth logging and destructive practices, or you can go down with gravity if you've aligned the economy with government policies, incentives, and regulations for a value-added second growth forest industry transition. This is where the government needs to go. They've made some indication they may be headed there. It's not explicit enough. And in general, there needs to be a conservation economy strategy. Research shows that when you get major protected areas, the surrounding communities benefit economically, not just tourism and recreation, but in terms of real estate and construction. Skilled labor locates to areas with a higher environmental quality of life, and you get all sorts of industries that can proliferate where you get skilled labor. Non-timber forest products, recreational and commercial fishing are supported through the ecosystem services, as well as a whole lot of other important supports for businesses. So a conservation economy strategy will also help. Okay, I want to put one thing out here. The environmental movement has typically ignored what's going on in the political context in which governments operate. They've given a pass to the conservative opposition in BC that has been pushing against protected areas and saving old growth forests. The position of the conservative opposition in British Columbia is diametrically opposed to the agenda to expand protected areas and save old growth forests. And governments do not operate in a vacuum. There are pressures and constraints that allow them to move forward or not, including the economy, including support for First Nations, including the consciousness and awareness of people, including people environmentalists typically don't talk to. A lot of working class British Columbians, businesses, faith groups, multicultural outreach. This is the kind of stuff that the environmental movement needs to partake in, as well as holding the opposition accountable for their positions. And this all, as a greater whole, determines where government can go. The NDP government has got to show more leadership, absolutely, but the environmental movement has got to show leadership as well and deal with the bigger political context in which this is all nested. So we can get it done. It's going to be a lot of work the next 4 years, but we're up to it, and I know you are too.